I'm doing a deep dive. So we're learning this together. Mishlei, Proverbs, is found in the third part of the Tanakh of the Hebrew Bible, not the Torah, not the Nevi'im, not the prophets, but the Ketuvim, the writings. We'll see in a second a text that has a different tradition, but in our tradition of the canon, the way that our Hebrew Bibles are printed these days, it appears as the second book in Ketuvim, in the writings after Psalms. We'll talk a little bit today about the tradition that these are writings from the wisdom of Solomon, and hence the title today. These words of wisdom, are they of Solomon? So we'll deal with that. That's in the first verse already. But in general, we're talking about literature that is from the latter half of the first millennium BCE. All right, I don't want to get too specific. Some dated as early as the 6th or 5th century BCE. I mean, in the scholarly world, some dated a little bit later. But what I managed to read is that probably the final form of this book takes place after Alexander the Great brings Hellenism down into our part of the world, that is the land of Israel. So 5th century, 4th, in that case, 4th century, but around that 5th or 4th century BCE. It's closely related to other wisdom books, like Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, which perhaps we should have done that because it's a much shorter book. There's wisdom in literature. Part of wisdom literature is the book of Job as well, but also different other parts of the Hebrew Bible count for wisdom. That is, they're not prophecy, and they're not law, and they're not narrative prose and poetry. Well, these are poetic, but not liturgical poetry. Examples of wisdom literature in general, folks, when they hear the term wisdom literature, assuming they haven't studied Bible in the university level, what do people think of? Really? Nothing?
Wisdom literature.
I'm sorry?
Torah.
Psalms, I don't know.
So Psalms, there is some wisdom literature in Psalms. So that, I guess that begs, what's the definition of wisdom literature, right? It's advice about life, about ethics. It's not so much specific things how to do from what we would call a religious point of view. It's not prayer. So much of Psalms is prayer. Much of the Torah's laws. I guess some sections, especially Deuteronomy, could be considered wisdom literature. But when we go beyond the confines of the Hebrew Bible, we get to other literature. There are famous books like the Wisdom of Solomon, which is part of apocryphal literature. For those that grew up studying New Testament, the Sermon on the Mount, or in the other tradition, the Sermon on the Plain, that's very much wisdom literature. Less rightly says Pirkei Avot, the chapters of the Father. In the Mishnah, that's a great example of rabbinic wisdom literature. There's a little bit more in a later time. The Pirkei Avot is in the Mishnah, yet it reflects some of the oldest traditions, oldest oral traditions that we have, if we base them upon the names that are given, which are, some of them are before the destruction of the temple. In Greek philosophy, there's certainly a ton of wisdom literature, and as we mentioned in ancient Egyptian and Mesopotamian, which is just less known in the Western world as much as Greek philosophy. The Hebrew term for the book of Proverbs is Mishlei, which is actually a construct form. It's mishalim, belonging to, or we'll take a look at that in a second. But mashal, we use, Ella will tell us in modern Hebrew, mashal is an example, a parable, right? But it turns out that mashalim in this book is much wider. That's one form, and there aren't actually that many parables here, but there are. There's just, that's why for me the best translation is the words of wisdom. So as we go, let's comment on it. We don't have to say too much before, and I think we should dive into the text. And yeah, just other forms of wisdom literature in the Jewish tradition. We have Avot de Rabbi Natan, which is, let's say, it's a kind of a Talmudic expansion of Pirkei Avot. Masechet Derech Eretz, that is the tractate of good manners, that would be translated perhaps. There's something in medieval Jewish literature called ethical wills, perhaps people have heard of. They've kind of risen in popularity over the last decade or two, with people writing things to their children, to their grandchildren. Yeah, Aesop's fables are a great example of wisdom literature, or in medieval literature, in medieval Jewish literature, but I think copied from Christian culture. There's a lot in Bill's collection called Mishlei Shualim, fox parables, I guess, and many of them have material that comes from Aesop's fables. Yeah. So fable is another word that's used, but it doesn't really include everything that we're going to see in here. We will see certainly things that are theological, things that are about God, but not just. And then, yeah, so let's use the text unless there's any general questions beforehand about what we're going to do. The format will be more or less like we've been doing for many years now. We'll send out the text beforehand, the day before. So perhaps make sure that our emails are not going into your junk file. If you were signed up, you didn't get this today, then just maybe tag us, tag whatever you do to tag that we're not a junk mail. And I'll put the Hebrew on the text. I think we're predominantly a Jewish group here many of whom have some Hebrew background. You don't need to know the Hebrew, but I like to have it here for those of you that do, and you can always point out a word. Perhaps I will as well. And I'll try to bring some other material as I did today, which is why I'm not entirely sure we're going to get through the text of the first chapter. Okay, Malka, did you want to add anything for our conversation?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay. Well, in any case, it's good to see everybody again after our break. And but Malka, I will ask you perhaps to read the first section, which is verses 1 through 7.
For learning wisdom and discipline, for understanding words of discernment.
Oh, you skipped over the first verse.
Proverbs of Solomon.
Oh, I'm sorry. Right. That's one of the most important. The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. For learning wisdom and discipline, for understanding words of discernment, for acquiring the discipline for success, righteousness, justice, and equity, for endowing the simple with shrewdness, the young with knowledge and foresight. The wise man hearing them will gain more wisdom. The discerning man will learn to be adroit. For understanding proverb and epigram, the words of the wise and their riddles. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and discipline.
Okay. So what have we learned about this book? What are the things that come up?
Mishlei Shlomo.
So Mishlei Shlomo, these are the Proverbs of Solomon. Here it's translated Proverbs as in many places. So Solomon, the son of David, and who's the king of Israel. And you might say, like, duh, we don't know. Well, yeah, it could be Mishlei Shlomo, some other guy, Solomon Schwartz, who wrote these words of wisdom. It could be, but maybe there's a point here, and I think there is, in saying Solomon, who was the son of David, that connection between father and son. We'll get back to that in a second. Who is this? Who are these words for? But also letting us know that this is something that we need to pay attention to. So it seems like, and the typical thing that you'll hear from a traditional Jew is, who wrote the book of Proverbs? People will immediately say Solomon. Now, modern scholarship no longer thinks that, really. While there may be there are scholars that say, well, maybe Solomon, did have this tradition of wisdom, and therefore he gets a prime mention here, a credit, right? A credit, like in a movie, but also because it could be an alternative explanation. What could be, other than Solomon writing these things down, especially since a lot of this material already appears in more ancient than Bible literature, like in Egypt and Mesopotamia. What else could this mean?
It could be because Solomon, when he was building the temple and God asked him what did he want, Solomon didn't ask for wealth, he asked for wisdom. So they attribute things that have chokhmah to Shalom.
Right. Right. So you know what? Since you brought that up, why don't you hold your fingers? I don't know if you're looking online or if you've got it printed out. Let's go to that first source that's below the Mishle text. It's at the bottom, second half of the second page. So this is a bit of a lot of text here, but why don't we start with this first paragraph? Harold, if you would, from Kings 3, chapter 3 and chapter 5.
At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, "Ask, what shall I grant you?" Solomon said, "You dealt most graciously with your servant, my father David, because he walked before you in faithfulness and righteousness and in integrity of heart. You have continued to him, giving him a son to occupy his throne, as is now the case. And now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David. But I am a young lad with no experience in leadership. Your servant finds himself in the midst of the people you have chosen, a people too numerous to be numbered or counted. Grant then your servant an understanding mind to judge your people, to distinguish between good and bad. For who can judge this vast people of yours?"
Okay, let's take a break for a second. So everybody, we're on the second half of the second page under the title Kings, 1 Kings. And this is the narrative from the book of Kings. This is historiography, right? This is narrative prose. This is not wisdom literature itself, but it does give us a particular background, which I'm not saying is historically true, but certainly it's there as a tradition that we've got this wonderful king. And some of us have studied the stories of David before many years ago, 6 years ago, maybe. We did David, the man who could not love. I don't have a great opinion of King David. I can show that the narrative. It's not personal. I mean, I don't know him or anything, but it's part of my overall campaign against holding on to the idea of Mashiach ben David, Messiah, son of David, as something. We got some extra noise here. Please, if you're not speaking, if you could, shush yourself. And so, but this does give the background. And here Solomon seems to be extremely modest, right? I got this job. I don't really know what to do, right? I wasn't trained. So if that happened today, what will we tell somebody?
You learn.
What's that, Eileen?
You learn on the job.
You learn on the job.
I said, ask your father.
Ask your father. Well, my generation, perhaps it's an age thing, but usually we tell people just to Google it, right? You don't know what to do. There's a YouTube for it. There's a TED Talk for it, right? We look to things. But if we were going into the bookstore, what shelf would we go to?
Self-help.
Self-help is one of them. Self-help, though, I think, and maybe I'm wrong, I think a lot of self-help is really about your inner angst about getting along in the world, whoever you are.
To
The do-it-yourself section.
yeah, how to.
Yeah. Serena, did you want to say something?
How to,
right? So that's for, especially if it's like, your garage door is broken and you can't get somebody to fix it. This out there. How do you be what are the best with Stephen Covey, was that his name, right? Those rules for getting by and being, all those different books. A lot of it is professional development. I mean, this huge industry of how do you do something. I used to read through a lot of those books in the late 90s when I was researching to start the fellowship program that I ran for 17 years called Rikma, looking for things that would help rabbis, rabbinical students, learn the job of what I thought was necessary to be a successful rabbi in Israel, which is different than the United States for various reasons. And we did find a number of them over the years, and I kind of went through a lot of them, and I have tons of them in my house. Most of them I found at some point were repetitious, and many of them were just based on the individual's own stories. A lot of storytelling, and storytelling is really important, but at some point it felt more like self, this is who I am, I, and less, for what I found over the years is when you find somebody and meet with somebody and have a relationship with somebody who's successful in what they're doing, that's when I learn the best, right? That's when I learn the most.
Is there a becoming king of Israel for dummies?
Yeah, it's kind of what he's asking for, yeah. Except for he wants it, while he goes to sleep at night, the way that we always dreamt that we would study for a test, put the book under our pillows and just and be wise. But yeah, there is a self, I don't know what to do, and you got to help me here, God. Okay, so let's go on to so let's go ahead and read the second paragraph. The Lord was pleased.
The Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked for this. And God said to him, because you asked for this, you did not ask for long life, you did not ask for riches, you did not ask for the life of your enemies, but you asked for discernment and dispensing justice. I now do as you have spoken. I grant you a wise and discerning mind. There has never been anyone like you before, nor will anybody like you arise again. And I also grant you what you did not ask for, both riches and glory all your life, the like of which no king has ever had. And I will further grant you long life if you will walk in my ways and observe my laws and commandments as did your father David.
Right. So kind of like Aladdin story, or the genie in the bottle, perhaps, but with that theological twist to it, right? Yeah, you're going to get all these things, but remember, you still got to put on tefillin every morning, right? And keep it up. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's see what ended up happening at the top of the third page.
Back on the third page now. Okay. God endowed Solomon with wisdom and discernment in great measure, with understanding as vast as the sands on the seashore. Solomon's wisdom was greater than the wisdom of all the Kedemites. Are those the people that make the grape juice? And then all the wisdom of the Egyptians. He was the wisest of all men, wiser than Ethan, the Ezrahite, and Heman, Chalcol, and Darda, the son of Mahol. His fame spread among all the surrounding nations. He composed 3,000 proverbs. Oh, we have to read 3,000 proverbs. And his songs numbered 1,005. He discoursed about trees, from the cedars in Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the wall. And he discoursed about beasts, birds, creeping things, and fishes. Men of all peoples came to hear Solomon's wisdom, sent by all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom.
Right. So I can't believe I said to introduce this paragraph. Now we'll see what really happened. I, of course, didn't mean what really happened. What the author or the editor of the Book of Kings wants us to feel, believe. And so this is at least in the tradition, the Jewish and Christian tradition, as to why this connection, other than that first opening line from the book of Proverbs, what this connection with Solomon was. Now, the fact that he said these 3,000, it's not really clear whether, well, he composed 3,000 Proverbs, but does that mean, it could also mean, under Solomon's rule, if we wanted to get historical here, which I usually don't want to do, but those that want to see historicity in these accounts could say, well, it's not necessarily that Solomon wrote, composed, or Solomon dreamed up these things, but Solomon made a list. Solomon's collection of wisdom, like all the other anthologies that people have done over the years, and that anthologies of wisdom is something that is common to ancient Near Eastern literature, both Egyptian and Mesopotamian. So one person gets the name of the person that brought it all together, like Aesop, whoever Aesop was. There's Aesop's fables. I'm sure there wasn't that. Those were collection of traditions from all sorts of parts of the Greek speaking, and perhaps even before that as well. I don't know the topic. So yeah, this is the grandeur of Solomon from a historical collective memory point of view. He's the guy that had all these things. By the way, for those that have already studied the Book of Kings, know that as promising as he was, it still didn't help Healthnish, right? He still got married to too many women and had too many horses, and the downfall was that his two sons argued in a severe way and created a split kingdom, at least how the story is told. So wisdom is certainly not a safeguard it's not a guarantee for a successful continuation of your family. Yes, Klaus.
Yeah. Which part of Israel did Solomon rule? Was the country united at the time?
Yes.
Or was it just a piece of it?
Yeah, the way that the Samuel and Kings presented is the country was first under all the tribes were united under Saul, but that didn't go well. So it's really only that unification cemented under David. It was fought a lot, the different borders were fought, and then David was the one who really kind of completed, again, the way that the books are edited and the way we see them when we take a step back, is that under David, all the wars were fought, and then David, on his own deathbed, says, Solomon, you're the one. Solomon's name, of course, in Hebrew is Shlomo, Shalom. And Solomon had the benefit of not having to fight these wars and having all this land, which meant all this taxation and all this geld in the bank, all this money in the bank, and was able to build the temple and to make partnerships with the people up in Lebanon for the wood and the rocks from someplace else, all these kinds of things. So it was definitely unified. But then when he dies, his two sons split, the kingdom splits. And that's when you get the northern kingdom, at least according to the story that we have it. I keep saying, let's go to the story because for all we know, there was never really a unification like that. I mean, you know that I'm not great on the historical side of it. This would be great. Maybe I mentioned to sometime in the last few days that my young friend Ido Koch is coming to lecture on idolatry at UCLA, and I'm going to see if I can share it with everybody, or if it's a closed thing. I think I'm going to be able to go, but I'll see. And I don't know if people are going to go to LA for this, but he's really an expert from an archaeological point of view about this time of Solomon, this time of. I heard a wonderful lecture from his friends and colleagues about a temple down in the valley where Moza is, for those that know the geography, leading up to, it's the last kind of valley you go to before you go up to Jerusalem, on the road from Tel Aviv, and there's ruins of a temple there that are exactly the same measurements as the Temple of Solomon, which leads the archaeologists to believe this was a temple that was created during that time when there was only supposed to be one temple. Of course, there were many temples, and this was a temple in the same style, that there were other temples built in the same style. And so what archaeology teaches is, as I'm sure you're not surprised, something very, very different than what we find in the texts themselves. But back to wisdom. So Solomon needed some help, and it turns out that he becomes the greatest of all. And why? I think the moral of the story is because he was modest in what he asked for, right? He didn't ask for wealth, but he got it anyway, right? And what he asked for was help me a little bit to rule these people, because there's so many of them, he mentions, by the way, and so complicated, and he ends up getting this. And so that kind of gives us, and it could be that that's how we get that first verse in the book of Proverbs. In light of this, that's what most scholars would say. Yes, Les?
Going back to the text, I guess it's maybe the 5th line down, the word equity jumped out at me because it's such a modern word. What's the Hebrew word, and does it mean the same thing as we talk about now about equity?
Are we back in Proverbs now? Where are you now?
No, I'm sorry. Back in Proverbs.
Back in Proverbs. So we'll get to that in just a second. Okay.
Okay. I'm sorry. I thought you were
question. Hold it. Yeah. Okay. All right.
I was thinking of the case, maybe why wisdom also is attributed to Shlomo, because how he learned to adjudicate cases, when he had the case of the 2 women and one's child died. And he initially said, well, okay, I can't decide whose child really died and whose child lived, to cut the child in half. So that was utilizing wisdom.
Right. Yeah. I think in general, and he managed to survive that impossible intrigue and drama of David's family, right? Of David's children. So he obviously was, no, let's assume right now as a historical figure, let's assume also that with he had to know a lot to get by. Look at the perfect politician, or I don't know, and adjudicator. So we'll go back to the text in just a second, but I want to do these other two sources because it's in the first verse. Where does Mishle come from? And to see that even in rabbinic literature, it's not so simple to say that Solomon gave us the book of Mishle. Eileen, do you want to do B? This is from Midrash Shir Hashirim Rabbah.
Sure. King Solomon wrote 3 books, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs. Which one did he write first? Rabbi Haya, Rabbah, and Rabbi Yochanan said Proverbs was written first, then Song of Songs, then Ecclesiastes, and based it on this source. He composed 3,000 Proverbs. Proverbs is the book of Proverbs, and his songs numbered 1,005. This is the Song of Songs, and Ecclesiastes he wrote last.
Right.
A text teaches that he wrote the 3 at the same time. Rabbi Haya and Rabbah taught that Solomon had only the Holy Spirit upon him during old age and wrote the 3 books, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs.
Okay, all it was just because it's part of the same section. I mean, do we really care? Let's say, first of all, the 3 books are attributed to Solomon. So that's a good thing to know in the Talmudic world, in the rabbinic tradition. And do we care which one was written when? Well, for me, it's important to get to this last section of the conversation.
Rabbi Yochanan said Song of Songs was written first, then Proverbs, then Ecclesiastes. And what is the basis for Rabbi Yochanan? From the way of the world, when a person is young, he offers words of song. When he ages, he offers proverbs. When he gets old, he offers cynicism. Rabbi Yanai said, in the name of Rabbi Ami, all agree that Ecclesiastes was written last.
I like this idea of the different ages of like when you do one. It's kind of this translation says, this interpretation of the Talmud says you write Song of Songs when you're young because you're full of song. Also, it happens to be the most erotic of the books in the Hebrew Bible. So, there's a sexual strength as part of being young as well, I guess. And then this kind of middle age or beginning of old age where you think you've got it figured out. And then this old age where you say, I thought I had it figured out, but you know what? Hevel havalim, hakol everything is vapor, everything is nothing. And that cynical kind of approach. So we're lucky to be studying this, and maybe that's the reason that I didn't want to do Kohelet, right? I didn't want to do Ecclesiastes. It's a little bit too cynical. And then finally, Dan, if you could read from Baba Batra. This is just a small section from what is in biblical studies in the university, one of the first texts that you do. And that's why I loved it. When I got there in 1982, in the introduction, Professor Emmanuel Tov gives this introduction, and the first day, our homework was to go read this section of the Talmud. I said, oh, I can utilize what I learned in yeshiva. I can do Talmud in the Bible department. And this is just the last section of it, but it also gives us a sense of humility about what we think is Jewish. People say, well, the Jewish Bible is what's always been, right? The Torah and Joshua, Judges, etc. And then when you get to the writings, well, it turns out it's not so simple. Not the order of the texts, the way they are in a Hebrew Bible or a Jewish Bible, and not necessarily who wrote them. Go ahead, Dan.
The order of the writings is Ruth in the Book of Psalms and Job and Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs and Lamentation, Daniel and the Scroll of Esther, and Ezra and Chronicles.
Okay, this is the canon, the order of the canon, right, of the 24 books. And it's very different than the Ketuvim, the way we have it. We have the 5 Megillot together. This is done in a different way. So there's a different logic going on. For those that have looked through Bibles when you're sitting in a church or you have other Bibles in house and you see that a Christian Bible, it's sometimes hard to find what you're looking for. If you're used to it, if you're not used to the Hebrew Bible, you just look at the table of contents. But if you're used to finding the books in the order that I would, right, at the minute I open up any Tanakh, any Hebrew Bible, it's not the same thing in a Christian Bible. And they're a little bit different depending on what part of Christianity. Go ahead.
And who wrote the books of the Bible? Moses wrote his own book, and the portion of Balaam, and Job. Joshua wrote his own book and 8 verses in the Torah. Samuel wrote his own book, Judges and Ruth. David wrote the book of Psalms by means of 10 elders by Adam, the first man, and by Melchizedek, king of Salem, and by Abraham, and by Moses, and by Haman, and by Yedutun, and by Asaph, and by the 3 sons of Korach.
So let's just dwell on this a second. The other things are less important, but this is already the Ketuvim. We all think and say, and people will say, well, who wrote the book of Psalms? King David. But the Talmud doesn't say that. What does the Talmud say?
By means of, and they specify a bunch of other people.
In other words, he was the editor.
We had ghostwriters.
Ghostwriter. He was the collector, the editor, ghostwriter. And that's because due to the text. If you look at the text, there's all these individuals show up in titles of Psalms, of the 150 Psalms. Okay, go ahead.
Jeremiah wrote his own book and the book of Kings and Lamentations. Hezekiah and his colleagues wrote Isaiah, Proverbs, Song of Songs, and Ecclesiastes. The members of the Great Assembly wrote Ezekiel and the 12 prophets. Wrote Ezekiel and the 12 prophets, Daniel and the scroll of Esther. Ezra wrote his own book and the genealogy of the book of Chronicles until his period.
Okay. And this idea of putting Hezekiah, King Hezekiah in it shows up here. That's actually based on a verse in chapter 25 in the book of Proverbs, in which it says that Hezekiah was the one who collected all these things. So one thing to remember here, and then we'll get back to the text itself, is that while there is a tradition of this being part of Solomon's legacy, literary legacy of wisdom, we could easily see how the first verse of Proverbs and the traditions, certainly in the Talmud tradition, which are many centuries later, talks about Solomon more as a collector. And that's what kings do. They collect traditions. And it doesn't mean that he's sitting in his scribble, he's actually writing them down, but it could very well mean that he's publishing. Like, what would be the greatest example of that from Western history?
The King James?
Exactly what I was thinking of. The King James Version, as if King James went to study Hebrew and this is what he did. No, he set up the deal, right? In the same way that Ptolemy, the King Ptolemy, I don't know how to say it in English, but Ptolemy, didn't translate the Septuagint. He had, according to the legend, he had 70 wise people sit down and translate it. So, yeah, that's what kings do. All right. So, are there any comments or questions about that kind of background that I felt it was? I think it was a good idea just to get that, because people are going to say all the time that when you tell them they're studying and I want to do something before we end. Please remind me before we end. I want to blow shofar because today is Rosh Chodesh, and since we don't meet on a regular basis, and that's the custom. So it's good that I put it right here, and I didn't see it until I actually bumped against it. Okay. So let's go back to the text, or is there anything somebody wanted to say? Okay, so that was the first verse. Okay, so then comes this long list of things, right? Of learning wisdom and discipline, understanding words of discipline. In other words, you wanna know how to live your life. Read this book. And who is it addressed to? Who's the you?
Everybody.
And where do you see everybody here?
The young.
Right.
My son.
So it's from the young to the next, to the rest of that verse. Sorry?
People.
I'm not getting it, please. Let's do one at a time. Klaus, did you want to say something?
And let Roberta read, please.
No. He asked a question.
Is somebody trying to say, Ella, are you trying to say something? No, okay. I felt like we lost somebody's. Okay, so you have
I thought he was writing it says to his son, to his children.
it starts that way, right? It doesn't say his daughters, by the way. It says son.
No.
You know, right, we'll get to that in a second. We're going to get in the next verse, we're going to get to the son. But it's from the young to the wise man, right? In other words, everybody has something to learn from this book. So let's look at those things, as those different words. There's a lot of words we don't really know, or it's hard to know how to translate, and they're from the same semantic field. But is there a difference between, to understand a mashal, a militza, a divrei chachamim, v'chidotam, and you know, these words, discernment of riddles, even perhaps, and then you get to this word righteousness, justice, and equity as less brought up. Okay, so if you see in the Hebrew, for those that that can follow the Hebrew, looking at the third line, lakachat musar haskel, to acquire the discipline for success, right? Tzedek u'mishpat u'mesharim, righteousness, justice, and mesharim. Mesharim is the word that you were asking about, equity. So for those that know Hebrew, mesharim, what would be the root? Yashar, Yud Shin Resh, which means straight, honesty, and level. So do you see how they got from that to equity, Les?
Okay.
I would say it's like creating a level playing field. Mesharim. Yeah.
Well, I guess it's interesting because it's a word that's used very lately to demonstrate issues, and obviously this was not written yesterday, so they translated it as equity for many years. Then you're telling me.
Well, this translation is from the 70s, right, or the 80s, or the 70s, I guess. But I didn't do a deep dive. You know, there's this site, Blue. It's not the Blue Letter. Maybe it's the Blue Letter Bible. There's Biblical Gate. There's a few sites that you can go to where you can get, you know, 20, 30 English translations. Some of them, I don't know where they even come from. I don't know where all of them come from, but you can see how it was translated in different ways. But when people speak today about equity, and that's become we're getting a lot of noise from somebody here. Let's try this.
Why doesn't everybody mute themselves who's not speaking?
Yeah. When we talk about equity today, and it's become a loaded button, right? When we talk about equity, we are talking about, you know, leveling the playing field, aren't we? And literally, meshar means a mesharim is a from a geographical or a topographical point of view is a plane, something flat, something even. Yeah.
Let me just be clear. I think it's a great word, and it's distinguished from equality, and it's important. I'm just surprised to see it being used in a past period where it's such a modern word. I think it's great.
I hear what you're saying. And perhaps we also don't delude ourselves into thinking that this applied to slaves. Right? While this is being said, there are still slaves in the world that are sanctioned by the same scripture, by the same texts. So it's not, it's kind of like, you know, when we think of democracy in ancient Rome, right? Right. We know it was for the relative few. So, but still, yeah, the idea is there, and yeah, sure, very much so. Okay. All right. Anything else in this section? So until the third to last line, which is the last verse here, this could have been said in so many different settings, right? There was nothing. It's civic. It's civics, right? It's proper behavior. It's derech eretz. But then what comes in at the end?
The fear of the Lord.
Right.
Right.
El and Dan, right, exactly. The fear of the Lord. So this is not secular literature, purely secular literature, although a lot of it is. We won't always see God mentioned here, but here very much it's brought into. And what is the outcome of the fear of the Lord?
beginning of knowledge.
Chokmah.
Right.
Right.
Well, Chokhmah, the beginning,
Da'at, Chokmah.
right? But it's in other words, the fear of the Lord from a educational point of view it creates the opportunity. Not as if to say that if you don't have the humility, I think here, the fear of the Lord more than anything else in our world would be considered humility. Without humility, you're not open to gaining these insights and this understanding.
Mm.
You know, when we hear about people today who talk about they've done their research, right? That caricature of people who have done their research about, and which is always online, of course, and never in a real book or in an academic study, or very often. We think of them as, you know, don't bother me with the facts, right? Don't, you know, I don't care. You know, everything is suspect. Anything that's been written, that's been researched in a very detailed way is going to be suspect. To me, that's kind of fools despise wisdom and discipline. Discipline is really is a really important thing that I think is missing from a lot of fields. It's a lot of fields. We feel it now. Yeah, who gets to become an expert today? How do people become experts? It used to be to become a therapist, you had to go through, I don't know how many years and years of academic education, your bachelor's, your master's, your doctor, PhD to become a psychiatrist and to analyze yourself. And now there's people who are, you know, who do, maybe there always were, but it's just so common, you know, the whole world of coaching, or the world of rabbinics and cantors of people who get a rabbinic, I'm speaking now, and perhaps not from the most altruistic point of view, but people that get their ordination online after a year or a year and a half of study, all online. It's a very different kind of education, and you know, and there's all different, you know, people who officiate at weddings, kids that have their friends who are kids officiate at weddings, and I understand everybody should do what they want to do, but sometimes I take a step back when I'm at one of these weddings and I say, you know, somebody with a little bit more experience and study and discipline would have handled a difficult situation better. In the same way we want to go to, I think of this going to the doctor, and I don't get my doctor, I get the other guy, the what's it called?
The resident, the intern,
not the intern,
physician's assistant.
the assistant.
Yes, physician assistant.
Or nurse practitioner.
Yeah, so the PA. So sometimes, yeah, knowing what goes into being a nurse practitioner, maybe I'm wrong, Les, but it feels to me there's a lot more experience and that goes into being a nurse practitioner. Only because Sasha's looked into it, she has a lot of experience. And I don't want to say, but it's not the same. A doctor has seen different things. I feel at my age so this shortcut, the industry of shortcuts, let's call it that. I'm perturbed by that a little bit, the lack of discipline. And you know me, I'm not a conservative person. I don't think I am, but that's what I feel here in this. Yeah, fools despise wisdom and discipline, because discipline, it takes a lot of work. Yeah, to actually read the book. Did you read the book?
Although when it comes to nurse practitioners, sometimes you're better off with them than the doctor if it's something very specific, because I find, and one of my doctors has a nurse practitioner who just is very focused on one issue. And since it's my issue, when I see her, I have more confidence with her than with the doctor, who's more generalized.
Yeah, absolutely. And I see Les agrees with that as well. I think I was thinking in terms of having my annual checkup. You know, I let my doctor, well, I don't think that, I think for once a year, I should see an MD, I think. I don't know. Anyway, I want to stay healthy. All right. Anything else on this section, from personal gripes like I just did to
Just wanted to say, I think it's the Malbim, that he says that word Mesharim just stuck with me. And I just remember that the Malbim says Mesharim is being able to accurately discern between polar opposites, like righteousness, unrighteousness, or like justice or humility or arrogance. And so that I was just thinking that's the way he understands that word.
That's great. Malbi Mer Levush, a Hasidic rabbi commentary of late 19th, early 20th century, I think, if I remember correctly. Very verbal, very verbose, I should say. It's sometimes really, really fascinating and often not that helpful when it comes to the simple meaning of the text. But I didn't look at that. That's a great thing to look at that. I love that interpretation. It's this discernment to, again, how do we calm things down, maybe? How do we get things from all the peaks, you know? Okay, great, thank you. Okay, then let's do another paragraph. Let's see, who's gonna read? Rita Claire, do you want to read 8 to 19?
Sure. My son, heed the discipline of your father, and do not forsake the instruction of your mother, for they are a graceful wreath upon your head, a necklace about your throat. My son, if sinners entice you, do not yield. If they say, come with us, let us set an ambush to shed blood. Let us lie in wait for the innocent without cause. Like Sheol, let us swallow them alive. Whole, like those who go down to the pit. We shall obtain every precious treasure. We shall fill our homes with loot. Throw in your lot with us. We shall all have a common purse. My son, do not set out with them. Keep your feet from their path, for their feet run to evil. They hurry to shed blood in the eyes of every winged creature. The outspread net means nothing, for they lie in ambush for their own blood. They lie in wait for their own lives. Such is the fate of all who pursue unjust gain. It takes the life of its possessor. Wow.
Okay, pretty loaded. Not sure we'll get through all of it, but let's take a stab. Why don't we start by breaking it down into smaller units, and with this, let's take the first 4 lines, right? Which are right. This is actually a famous line. Lots of songs over the years in the Orthodox world, especially Shema b'ni musar avicha v'al titosh torat imecha. So we had this before, but let's just state some of the obvious from a poetic point of view. This is a parallelism, right? As is all of biblical poetry. Seems to be, different sections. I forgot that. I don't know the names of the parts of poetry, but in Hebrew the word is tzela, is like a rib. The 2 ribs that are parallel to each other. So you have, listen, my son, or hear or heed. All those are possible. My son, to what? To musar avicha, to the discipline of your father. Musar, the ethics, the discipline. Again, ve'al titosh, so that's parallel to Shema. Parallel to heed is and don't forsake. And then the parallel to the discipline of your father is the instruction of your mother. Yes, Rita Claire.
Well, this hits home with me because I think of my own situation and my family. It was my husband who administered the discipline, and the children respected that. But I was the one at home with the children most of the time. So I would like to think that they received the proper instruction, I would hope, from me on how to treat people and how to act. So
and when
that's my experience.
And when you say proper instruction, are you implying that your husband's instruction was improper?
No, by no means. No means. I think he was very stern. And like I said, the kids respected that. They always try to please him. I think with me, I loved them unconditionally, and I think they were freer to be more themselves and to come to me if they had problems.
So lashlim, it's completing one another, perhaps. That's one way of looking at it too.
Yes.
Maybe both necessary. I think that feels to me like the simple meaning of the text here. Indeed, yeah.
It's a partnership.
Yeah. The partnership in which but the roles here are kind of divided from a gender point of view, right? You would say.
Yes.
So what about a situation where this is being spoken to where it isn't such a conventional family? A single mother, a single father.
You mean
or
like all the gay couples during Solomon's kingship?
Right, or the abusive. No, I wasn't thinking of gay families so much as I was thinking of abusive families, which must have existed then.
Yeah. So the text is all, I think all wisdom literature is going to be aiming at the norm, what is assumed to be the normative text of a normative situation of when this is being written. And I don't think it's supposed to encompass everything. And of course, there are many cases where the mother ends up being more of a disciplinarian than the father, right? It really kind of depends. There's a stereotype here, I think, it's being presented. Or another way of looking at it is that these are not such, there's no really a dichotomy here. These are just two aspects of education. Maybe they're the same. It's just different ways of saying the same thing. The discipline maybe is not the proper translation here, but Musar in general as ethics, as training. Yeah, I don't know. But there's more about the son here, father and son relationship in the book of Proverbs, certainly in this first chapter, than there are about mothers. Mothers do come up another 4 or 5 times that I could find. In the book, I didn't do a strenuous search, but mothers are involved, especially in the last chapter, which is the most famous chapter of Mishlei Eshet Chayil that some of us grew up with saying around the Friday night table. So let's keep our eye on where do mothers, where do women fit in, but it feels like what we have more than anything else is the father to son kind of a thing, which comes out in the title and comes out here again. So Ellen and then Ella.
I think Musar
Ella,
is
hold on, Ella, just a second. Ellen has her hand up. Go ahead, Ellen.
This strikes me as so relevant. My grandson is 13. He just started 7th grade. And I've been thinking to myself how fortunate we are that he is not a kid who is swayed by his peer group. He doesn't have to fit in. He doesn't have that urge. He is his own guy. And I think that so often, this just rings so true that children often feel like they have to follow the ways of other kids, despite they may know that that's not the right thing to do, but everybody's doing it and they want to do it too.
Right. So you're relating to the next section that is about the lawless crowd. Warn the kids about the peer influence, the bad influence. So Ella and then Malka.
I think Musar is more, it's not really discipline. It's more morals.
I think that's what the term became in Hebrew, Ella. So certainly in modern Hebrew, but even in medieval Hebrew, I think Musar, and there's a whole movement, the Musar movement, which has to do with behavior modification. But I think that many scholars see Musar in more of a disciplinary way in biblical Hebrew.
Oh, and also discipline is more mishmat.
Right. Again, in modern Hebrew, I don't know when the word mishmat came into. Mishmat literally comes from the word shama, which is here as well, to heed, to obey. Yeah. So that's an interesting question. When did we start to get the word mishmat, which we know in modern Hebrew? Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. So Malka, and then I think Rita has another comment. Go ahead.
I thought it was interesting that so many of the Proverbs are relating from father to son, but to gain wisdom, but wisdom herself is a female.
Yeah. we're going to get into trouble with wisdom as a she, as almost a demon, almost a demonic kind of thing. We're going to get some. This is a complex book when it comes from a gender point of view. Yeah. And Rita Clary, you had another comment?
I was just going to say, I think we all need discipline. Discipline to me also is setting boundaries. Not only that you have to be punished for wrongdoing, but being disciplined is setting boundaries for yourself, and as a parent, you set boundaries for your children, they learn. I think part of the problem with so many of the youth today is that parents are not setting boundaries. That's my feeling. And another thing I was going to say was kind of interesting is I was going to say my husband used to set the discipline, which was maybe punishment for something they did wrong. I was the one that was left at home to carry it out.
Okay, so I think we'll pick up with this paragraph when we meet next week again together on at 8:19. We still want to do the middle part, this avoidance of the bad crowd, and to look at some of this. There's a lot of interesting symbolic language of the whole thing, just like we find in the Gospel according to John that lately we've been studying on Thursdays. Is there's a lot of, we have to be really careful about not being literal. There's the issue of there's jewelry used here. There's from the animal world, but let's take a moment for a second to usher in this month of Elul on this day of Rosh Chodesh, the first of Elul, and to listen to where the sound of the shofar brings us in our reflections of how we have been ethical and we have been working towards equity in the things that have come up today. Okay, everybody. See you next week. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.